For 3 years, Margaret Chen had perfected the art of invisibility, mopping floors, emptying trash, and listening to the whispered secrets that people never guard around just the janitor. But when convicted cop killer Danny Reeves crashes through the hospital's emergency entrance with a bullet in his side and murder in his eyes, the 58-year-old janitor drops her mop, pulls her concealed Glock, and reveals what no one at St. Catherine's Medical Center ever suspected. She's been a U.S. Marshal the entire time, waiting for this exact moment. Margaret Chen had been invisible for 1,095 days. She knew the exact count because she marked each one in the small notebook she kept in her apartment, the one place where she could drop the carefully constructed facade of Margaret Chen, hospital janitor, and remember who she really was. Deputy U.S. Marshal Margaret Chen, deep undercover on the most patient operation of her 23-year career. Every morning at 4:47 a.m. she pulled on the same navy blue scrubs, tied her silver-streaked hair into a tight bun, and became nobody. Just another middle-aged woman pushing a yellow mop bucket through the sterile corridors of St. Catherine's Medical Center, ignored by doctors, dismissed by nurses, invisible to patients. It was perfect. The assignment had come down from the fugitive task force commander 3 years ago, delivered in a windowless conference room that smelled of burnt coffee and desperation. Danny Reeves, convicted cop killer, had escaped from a federal transport van outside Pittsburgh, leaving 2 marshals dead and a third paralyzed from the waist down. Intelligence suggested Reeves had connections to a network that moved fugitives through the Northeast, and every thread led back to St. Catherine's, not to anyone who worked there officially, but to someone who had access, who could move freely, who nobody would question. The kind of person who could slip a fugitive into a supply closet during shift change, or guide them through the maze of underground tunnels that connected the hospital to 3 other buildings. The kind of person everyone saw, but nobody noticed. Margaret had volunteered immediately. Her handler had tried to talk her out of it. 55 years old, eligible for retirement. Why spend 3 years mopping floors on the slim chance Reeves would show up? But Margaret had looked at the crime scene photos, at the 2 young marshals bleeding out on that Pennsylvania highway, and she'd known. Some hunts required patience. Some hunts required becoming part of the landscape, settling into the rhythms of a place until you weren't hunting anymore. You were just waiting, a spider at the center of an invisible web. The first year had been the hardest, not because of the physical labor, though her knees ached and her back protested the constant bending, but because of the loneliness of the performance. She'd created Margaret Chen, janitor, from scratch, a widow whose husband had died of cancer, no children, no close friends, quiet and reliable and utterly unremarkable. She ate lunch alone in the staff cafeteria, reading romance novels with dog-eared pages. She arrived early and stayed late. She learned everyone's names and habits, offered sympathetic nods when nurses complained about their shifts, and never, ever drew attention to herself. The other janitors thought she was standoffish. The nurses barely registered her existence. The doctors looked straight through her, discussing patients and procedures in voices they'd never use if they thought anyone important was listening. But Margaret was always listening. She'd positioned herself on the night shift, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. when the hospital ran on skeleton crews and security got sloppy. She'd mapped every entrance, every exit, every blind spot in the security camera coverage. She'd identified 3 employees with questionable connections, a nurse with a gambling problem, a security guard with a brother in prison, a transport driver who'd done time for fraud. She'd cultivated casual relationships with each of them, the kind where she'd offer a kind word or an extra break, building invisible lines of credit she might need to call in. And she'd waited. Year 2 brought a rhythm. She'd stopped thinking of herself as a marshal playing a janitor, and started thinking of herself as both, or neither, some hybrid creature who existed in the liminal spaces of the hospital, present but unseen. She knew which doctors were having affairs, which nurses were stealing medication, which patients were lying about their symptoms. She knew that Dr. Rodriguez cried in the supply closet after losing patients, that Nurse Jackson was getting divorced, that the security supervisor was building a case to fire 3 employees for consistent tardiness. She knew these things because people spoke freely around her, their words floating past like she was furniture, like she was part of the walls. The department checked in monthly through her handler, always in coffee shops far from the hospital, always asking the same questions. Any leads? Any suspicious activity? Any reason to think Reeves would surface? And every month, Margaret gave the same answer. Not yet. Keep the operation running. He'll come. She believed it with a certainty that bordered on faith, though she couldn't have explained why. Maybe it was the intercepted communications that mentioned St. Catherine's in oblique terms. Maybe it was the way 3 known associates of Reeves had all received treatment at the hospital within the past 18 months. Or maybe it was just instinct, the kind that comes from 2 decades of hunting fugitives, the sense that Reeves needed this place, this network, this escape route she'd spent 3 years mapping. By year 3, Margaret had almost forgotten what it felt like to be entirely herself. The lines had blurred. She genuinely cared when Nurse Jackson's divorce was finalized, genuinely felt satisfaction when the floors gleamed under the fluorescent lights, genuinely appreciated the simplicity of a job where success meant clean surfaces and empty trash cans. Some nights, mopping the oncology wing at 3 a.m., she'd wonder if she'd made a mistake, if she'd traded 3 years of her life for a ghost, if Danny Reeves would ever surface, or if he'd disappeared into some other identity, some other part of the country, leaving her to grow old, pushing a mop through corridors that would never yield the fugitive she'd sacrificed so much to catch. And then, on a cold February night with sleet tapping against the windows and the hospital settling into its graveyard shift quiet, the automatic doors of the emergency entrance exploded inward and Margaret's 3-year wait ended in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The doors didn't just open, they crashed, propelled by a man's shoulder striking them at full sprint, the pneumatic hinges groaning in protest. Margaret was 30 feet away, mopping the corridor that connected the emergency department to the main hospital, her mop making slow, methodical arcs across the linoleum while her mind wandered through the logistics of the morning shift change. The sound brought her head up instantly, her body tensing with an alertness that had nothing to do with her janitor persona and everything to do with 23 years of training. She saw him before he saw her, male, early 30s, 6 feet tall, dark hair plastered to his skull with rain and sweat, blood spreading across the left side of his torn jacket in a bloom of dark crimson. He was running like a man with nowhere left to go, his eyes wild with pain and fear and something harder, calculation. Margaret knew that face. She'd studied it in surveillance photos and wanted posters, memorized every line and angle, imagined this moment so many times that seeing him now created a strange sense of déjà vu, as if the past 3 years had been leading to this precise instant with an inevitability that felt almost like fate. Danny Reeves, cop killer, had just run into her hospital, into her territory, into the web she'd spent 3 years spinning. Time seemed to slow as her training took over, her mind moving through options and scenarios with mechanical precision, even as her hands continued their rhythmic mopping, maintaining the cover for 3 more precious seconds while she assessed the situation. Reeves stumbled past the triage desk, leaving bloody handprints on the white counter. The night nurse, Angela Martinez, jerked back with a gasp, reaching for the phone. Behind Reeves, Margaret could hear sirens approaching, distant still but getting closer. He'd been shot, was being pursued, and had chosen St. Catherine's as his refuge. Smart. He'd planned this, or someone had planned it for him. The hospital meant doctors who could treat gunshot wounds without asking too many questions, meant confused corridors and multiple exits, meant the underground network that could spirit him away if he could reach it. But to reach it, he needed help. He needed his contact, whoever was running the pipeline. And he needed not to get caught in the next 5 minutes by whatever law enforcement was screaming down the street outside. Margaret made her decision. She set the mop carefully in its bucket, straightened up, and stepped into Reeves's path. He was scanning the corridor desperately, looking for someone, and when his eyes swept past her, they didn't stop. She was just the janitor, not worth noticing. But then she spoke, her voice cutting through his panic with calm authority. "Danny Reeves, stop right there." His head snapped back toward her, confusion and disbelief fighting across his face. Margaret reached behind her back, beneath the loose fabric of her scrub top where she'd worn the pancake holster for 1,095 days, and drew her Glock 19. The weight of it in her hand after 3 years felt like coming home. "U.S. Marshal," she said, her voice steady as she aimed center mass. "Get on the ground, now!" For a frozen moment, Reeves simply stared, his brain trying to process the impossibility of the situation. The janitor, the grey-haired woman he'd probably walked past a dozen times in the past without seeing, was pointing a service weapon at him with the kind of calm competence that only comes from extensive training. Then, understanding flooded his face, followed immediately by rage. He'd been set up, or he'd walked into something he never saw coming. And in that instant, Margaret watched him make the calculation every fugitive makes when cornered: fight or surrender. She saw the muscles in his jaw tighten, saw his hand move toward his waistband where a bulge suggested he was armed. "Don't," Margaret said, her voice dropping an octave. "I've been waiting 3 years for this moment, Danny. I know you're armed. I know you're hurt. I know you're desperate. But I'm a very good shot. And I've got backup coming through those doors in about 90 seconds. Make the smart choice." Behind her, she heard movement. Angela at the triage desk was on the phone. Hospital security would be responding, and those sirens were close now, maybe 30 seconds out. But 30 seconds was an eternity, and Margaret watched Reeves's eyes flicker past her, calculating distances, looking for options. He was bleeding badly, leaving a trail of drops across the clean floor she'd mopped 20 minutes ago. The bullet had probably clipped something important. He was running on adrenaline and time was not his friend. Then everything happened at once. Reeves lunged forward, not toward her but toward the corridor that led to the elevators, his hand pulling a compact pistol from his waistband. Margaret moved without thinking, years of training overriding conscious thought. She sidestepped, keeping her weapon trained on him, and fired a single shot that cracked through the corridor like thunder. The bullet caught Reeves in the right thigh, not a kill shot. She needed him alive, needed answers about the network, and his leg buckled. He crashed into a wet floor sign, sending it skittering across the linoleum, his gun clattering away. He tried to rise, cursing, blood now flowing from 2 wounds, and Margaret closed the distance in 3 quick steps, her weapon never wavering. "Stay down," she commanded, planting her foot on his gun hand. Reeves thrashed once, twice, then subsided, his breath coming in harsh gasps. Margaret could hear running footsteps now, security, nurses, possibly the police finally arriving. She kept her gun trained on Reeves with one hand while reaching for the badge she'd worn on a chain around her neck for 3 years, tucked beneath her scrub top. She pulled it out, letting it catch the fluorescent light. Deputy U.S. Marshal, Fugitive Task Force. "Danny Reeves," she said formally, "you're under arrest for the murder of federal officers, escape from federal custody, and felony assault on a federal officer. That last one's new as of about 10 seconds ago." Hospital security burst around the corner, hands on their weapons, confusion written across their faces as they processed the scene. The janitor they'd ignored for 3 years standing over a bleeding man, holding a gun and a badge. "Marshal Chen," Margaret called out, her voice carrying authority. "Call this in to the Pittsburgh FBI field office, extension 447. Tell them the Reeves operation just went hot, and we need immediate medical support and prisoner transport." She looked down at Reeves, who was staring up at her with a mixture of pain and disbelief. 3 years, she said quietly. 3 years mopping these floors, waiting for you to make exactly this mistake. Welcome back to custody, Danny. The sirens reached crescendo outside as patrol units flooded the emergency bay. Margaret maintained her position, weapon trained on the fugitive she'd spent 1,095 days waiting to catch. Behind her, Nurse Angela was standing at the triage desk with her mouth open, the phone still pressed to her ear. The other night shift staff were emerging from their stations, drawn by the gunshot, staring at the transformation of invisible Margaret Chen into Deputy U.S. Marshal Margaret Chen. She could feel their confusion, their shock, the way reality was rewriting itself in their minds. The janitor who'd been part of the landscape, as permanent and unremarkable as the walls, had just revealed herself to be something else entirely. A hunter who'd been watching all along, patient and invisible, waiting for this single moment when 3 years of careful preparation would collapse into 30 seconds of action. And as police officers rushed through the doors and she began issuing commands with the authority of her real identity, Margaret felt the weight of the cover story lifting, felt herself stepping back into the skin of who she'd always been. The hunt was over. The fugitive was down. And Margaret Chen, Deputy U.S. Marshal, had just closed the most patient case of her career. The next 6 hours passed in a blur of debriefings, paperwork, and the organized chaos that follows any officer-involved shooting. Margaret sat in the hospital administrator's office, a room she'd cleaned dozens of times but never entered as anything other than furniture, and gave her statement to a succession of officials, local police, FBI, the U.S. Marshal Service Inspector General, even a representative from the Department of Justice who'd apparently been monitoring the Reeves operation from Washington. Her handler, Deputy Marshal Tom Kovach, arrived within 2 hours, looking exhausted and vindicated in equal measure. He'd been the one person outside the task force who'd believed the operation would pay off, who'd approved the budget for 3 years of deep cover on what many considered a long shot. "Told you he'd show," Margaret said when Kovach entered the administrator's office, and he laughed, the kind of laugh that carries 3 years of tension releasing all at once. They went through the shooting frame by frame. Reeves had taken a bullet to the thigh and still had the original gunshot wound to his left torso, sustained during whatever confrontation had sent him running to St. Catherine's in the first place. He was in surgery now, stable, guarded by 4 marshals who were taking no chances. The gun he'd pulled on Margaret was a .38 snubnose, unregistered, probably acquired from his network of contacts. Ballistics would match it against unsolved crimes. His fingerprints were already running through databases, and most importantly, his phone, recovered from his jacket pocket, was with the FBI's cyber team, being torn apart for contacts and communications that might finally expose the entire fugitive pipeline that had kept Reeves free for 3 years. "You know this is going to be a circus," Kovach said, leaning back in the administrator's chair. Through the office window, Margaret could see the hospital corridor she'd mopped so many times, now crowded with law enforcement. "Media's already outside. Undercover Marshal poses as janitor for 3 years is going to run on every news site by morning. You ready for that?" Margaret considered. For 3 years she'd been invisible, and some part of her had grown comfortable in that invisibility. But another part, the part that had joined the Marshal Service at 35 after a decade teaching elementary school, driven by a need to do something that mattered, that part was ready. "I'm ready," she said. "Let them run their stories. As long as we got Reeves and we can roll up his network, that's what matters." But as morning light began filtering through the hospital windows and the night shift gave way to day, Margaret found herself facing a different kind of challenge. Explaining herself to the people she'd worked alongside for 3 years without ever really knowing. The hospital staff were in shock. Some felt betrayed. She'd lied to them, pretended to be someone she wasn't, used their workplace as a hunting ground. Others were simply confused, trying to reconcile the quiet janitor with the federal agent who'd shot a fugitive in their corridor. Nurse Angela Martinez cornered her outside the administrator's office, her face a mixture of anger and something else, something softer. 3 years, Angela said. 3 years you listened to me complain about my divorce, nodded sympathetically, offered advice. Was any of that real? Or was I just part of your cover? Margaret met her eyes. This was the cost of deep cover that nobody talked about in the training manuals, the relationships you built on false foundations, the people who'd trusted a version of you that never really existed. It was real, she said carefully. The job was the cover. But the person, Margaret Chen, might not be exactly who I am, but she wasn't fake either. I did care about your divorce. I did want your husband to treat you better. That wasn't performance. That was just being human while doing my job. Angela studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You could have told me, she said. After a year, after 2 years. You could have trusted me. Margaret shook her head. The operation required total commitment. One person knowing, one slip, and Reeves never shows up. Or worse, Someone in his network tips him off and suddenly I'm the target. The invisibility wasn't just professional, it was survival. By midday, Margaret had given her formal statement, signed off on the shooting review, and been cleared to leave the hospital. She walked out through the main entrance, not the staff entrance she'd used for 3 years, but the front doors as herself, and was immediately hit by a wall of camera flashes and shouted questions. The media had assembled a full circus, local news, national networks, even some international outlets drawn by the dramatic narrative. Kovac had warned her, but the reality was still jarring. She made a brief statement. The arrest of Danny Reeves represented excellent work by the U.S. Marshal Service Fugitive Task Force. The hospital staff had been cooperative, and she couldn't discuss operational details of an ongoing investigation. The reporters shouted follow-ups. How did it feel to maintain cover for 3 years? Had anyone suspected? What would she do now? But Kovac guided her to an unmarked car, and they drove away. The next week brought a different kind of chaos. The Reeves case dominated headlines as the FBI worked through his phone and identified 17 members of the fugitive pipeline, leading to arrests across 5 states. 2 were St. Catherine's employees, the transport driver Margaret had suspected, and, surprisingly, a respiratory therapist she'd never considered. Both had been facilitating the movement of fugitives through the hospital's underground tunnel system, using medical transport vehicles to move people out of the building. Margaret's 3 years of surveillance had captured enough peripheral evidence to support the FBI's case. Danny Reeves, facing life in prison, began cooperating with prosecutors in exchange for taking the death penalty off the table for his murder of 2 federal officers. And Margaret became, briefly and uncomfortably, famous. The Today Show wanted an interview. People magazine proposed a cover story. A true crime podcast requested a 6-part series. Margaret declined them all. She did one interview with a retired marshal who ran a law enforcement podcast because she wanted to control the narrative and because she felt she owed something to the marshals who died on that Pennsylvania highway. She talked about the patience required for deep cover work, about the importance of invisible people, janitors, maintenance workers, security guards, who see everything because nobody's watching them. She talked about the 3-year commitment, not as a sacrifice, but as a different kind of service, no less important than the dramatic arrests that made headlines. And she talked about the cost, the isolation, the way pretending to be someone else for that long changes you in ways you don't fully understand until the operation ends and you try to figure out who you really are. 2 months after the arrest, Margaret sat in the same windowless conference room where the operation had begun, meeting with the task force commander. "You've got your 25 years in," the commander said. "Full pension. You've earned retirement. Or if you want to stay active, we've got a position in fugitive operations, traditional role, no more deep cover. You've done your time in the invisible world." Margaret considered. She was 58 years old. Her knees still ached from 3 years of mopping. She'd missed her nephew's wedding, her sister's 60th birthday party, countless holidays with family because Margaret Chen, the janitor, didn't have family. She'd earned the right to step back, to rest, to reclaim the life she'd put on hold. But she also remembered the moment Danny Reeves had run through those doors, remembered the 3 years of patience culminating in 30 seconds that mattered, remembered why she'd become a marshal in the first place. "I'll take 6 months, she said finally. 6 months to figure out who I am when I'm not mopping floors. Then we'll talk about what comes next." The commander nodded, satisfied. Margaret walked out of the federal building into a bright April afternoon, the city alive with spring and possibility. She thought about St. Catherine's Medical Center, about the corridors she'd walked so many times they'd become part of her internal geography. The hospital had hired a new janitor, 2, actually, to split the shifts. The night shift position Margaret had held for 3 years was now occupied by a retired schoolteacher named Ruth, who had no idea she was mopping the same floors where a 3-year operation had culminated in a single shot that echoed through the corridors and ended a manhunt. Margaret wondered sometimes if Ruth ever sensed the history in those floors, if the linoleum somehow retained the memory of blood and justice and a patient hunter who'd waited exactly as long as necessary. But probably not. The hospital moved forward, as hospitals do. And the night Margaret Chen revealed herself had become just another story the staff told new employees. Did you hear about the janitor who was actually a marshal? Crazy, right? Margaret didn't mind becoming a story. Stories had their place. But she knew the truth was more complicated. For 3 years she'd been both janitor and marshal, both invisible and watchful, both nobody and exactly who she needed to be. And when the moment arrived, when Danny Reeves crashed through those doors bleeding and desperate, she'd been ready. That was what the 3 years meant. Readiness. The patient work that nobody sees until the instant it matters, and then it's the only thing that matters. As Margaret drove home to her apartment, not Margaret Chen, the janitor's sparse studio, but her real home, the one with photos and memories and evidence of a life beyond the cover story, she felt the weight of the operation finally lifting. 3 years was a long time to be someone else, but it had been worth it. The fugitive was in custody, the network was rolled up, 2 dead marshals had received justice, however delayed, and Margaret Chen, Deputy U.S. Marshal, had proven what she'd always believed, that the most effective hunters are the ones nobody sees until the moment they step out of the shadows and pull their badge. She'd been just the hospital janitor, until she wasn't, and that made all the difference.